The Battle of Karansebes. In 1788 the Habsburgs launched a campaign into Romania, which was then under control of the Ottoman Turks, and made camp near Karansebes. During the night a Hussar cavalry unit had gone out to scout for enemies. On the way they would meet some locals who offered them liquor. Of course the Hussars accepted. Some hours later a separate infantry unit would go out scouting and met the Hussars, who were very drunk. The infantry asked the Hussars for some of the liquor. The Hussars refused. The infantry and Hussars kept arguing, until suddenly a soldier from the infantry shouted, "Turks! The Turks are here!" with the goal of scaring the Hussars. Both the Hussars and infantry started panicking, and during the panic a random infantry soldier accidentally fired a shot. The Hussars somehow came to the conclusion that the men they were arguing with were in fact Turkish soldiers disguised as friendly soldiers, and started charging towards and attacking the infantry. The infantry would started running back towards camp screaming, with the Hussars close by. Meanwhile an artillery commander back at camp, who had woken up upon hearing a gunshot in the distance, went outside to check, only to see a mass of soldiers charging toward the camp. Thinking they were Turks, the commander woke up the rest of the camp and ordered cannon fire on the approaching soldiers, while the entire rest of the Habsburg army hastily fled to escape from the enemy. 2 days later the Turkish army arrived, taking the strategically important Karansebes Valley and finding between 1,000 to 10,000 dead Habsburg troops. The battle is widely regarded as the worst friendly fire incident in history. The Wikipedia info tab summary is perfect. Belligerence: Habsburg monarchy versus Ottoman Empire. Man, those Ottomans were able to just kick their feet up and relax. This isn't just a tactical blunder by a general, but it's almost satirical, and I just learned about it so I share. The Baltic Fleet's journey and imminent demise in Japan. Long story, I'll try to make it short. No one was trained. The Baltic Fleet was essentially a retirement home for old vessels. A lot of the fleet wasn't even military, and they had to equip them with cannons etc., and they were sent to sail 18,000 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to Japan to reinforce the Russian Navy. In getting out of the harbor I believe it was 12, but can't remember the actual number and won't look it up because I'm already doing a lot here. Vessels were damaged from running into one another, running aground. One had an anchor problem, like they just didn't hoist their anchor, and so right off the hop, 12 boats down. Because of lack of training at sea, pretty much immediately after departing rumors spread amongst the fleet that Japanese torpedo boats were sitting in wait outside of Norway. Impossible, but they believed it. It was an epidemic of paranoia amongst the fleet. They also believed at any moment that they were over a minefield, and so boats would just randomly by swerving and doing all of these evasive maneuvers to dodge these mines. The first boat in the fleet reported being surrounded by 8 Japanese torpedo boats and engaged them. The rest of the fleet either also engaged, but couldn't see what they were firing at, or the crew laid on their backs on the deck believing at any moment they would be sunk, which for some reason is what they believed was the right thing to do if your boat was going down. The 8 Japanese torpedo boats were actually one Russian fishing boat which had actually been sent to deliver a message to the fleet. Miraculously not hit. Several of their own boats were though. They lose a boat, the one that mistook one Russian fishing boat for 8 Japanese torpedo boats, along the way, and had no choice but to hopefully meet up with them at their next restock point. Whatever boats actually made it to the first restock harbor decided that instead of restocking somewhere else, they would save a stop and just load up on as much coal as the ships could physically fit, which included storing coal in sleeping quarters, kitchens, etc. This resulted in people on board developing terrible lung disease. Several people died because of that alone. When they got to that restock point in Africa, morale was low. So they decided that what they would do is buy animals so that the crew could have pets, and that would boost the morale. But they were in Africa, so I guess the available pets were crocodiles and venomous snakes which escaped their enclosures and wandered the hulls of the ship. The ship that was lost was actually reunited with the fleet at that harbor in Africa, and when they reunited they reported that they had met and engaged with 3 different Japanese torpedo boats. This will not come as a surprise, but they were not Japanese torpedo boats, they were just fishing boats from different countries. So Russia had to convince all 3 of those countries that, no, that really was actually a mistake, we're not trying to engage in war with you. Luckily, not one of those fishing boats had been hit, so all was good I guess. They miraculously make it to Japan and go into stealth mode with all lights off except for the hospital boat. I know that's a rule of war, but still seems like it would give away their position to me. But whatever. A small boat approaches and they recognize it as a Russian fishing boat, so they tell them they have to leave the fleet alone. they're planning a big attack in the morning and they're going to give away their position. Unfortunately but unsurprisingly, it was not a Russian fishing boat, but was, in fact, a Japanese torpedo boat. They were completely decimated by the Japanese. You can look up the casualties and captives, but it was extremely lopsided. And that's the story of the Baltic Fleet as far as I know. They also had to go around Africa, if my memory serves me correctly, because the British closed the Suez Canal after the fleet opened fire on British fishing boats in the North Sea. This exacerbated supply and coaling issues. I also have read that some of the Russian fleet had to around Africa because their draft was deeper than anticipated. Part of the fleet did go through the Suez, and then met up with the other part off Madagascar. The detachment that went through the canal and had to wait off Madagascar did not fare well while waiting. Supplies, disease, etc. Just went on a cruise near Tsushima, so I went deep into that rabbit hole recently. General Custer at Little Bighorn. Despite credible intelligence reports of a large number of Native Americans taking up positions on nearby high ground, he directed his troops into a natural bowl and was decimated by his enemy. Lost more than 200 soldiers in less than an hour. I wrote my thesis on this battle, so I'll just summarize the whole deal. Custer was focused on the amount of people he could collect. They had been ordered to the reservations and refused. Native Americans were more likely to run previous to this than not. Capturing warriors was more likely to give him credit than capturing women and children. Custer had just been rebuked in DC by Grant. He wanted to regain his glory. Seeing point 1, it made much more sense to carry longer range rifles, especially seeing as running was more common, and the standard rifle was the single-shot trapdoor Springfield. Captain Benteen was on the Army Proving Board for the new carbine version for cavalry troopers. This is what Custer's troops were armed with. The carbine was made for .45 caliber bullets with 55 grains of black powder behind it, .45-55. The standard rifle round was a .45 caliber bullet with 70 grains of black powder behind it, .45-70. Tracking down the original receipts, Custer brought .45-70 with him for the Gatling guns he left behind. Leaving the heavy artillery behind to move faster, Custer ordered the ammo brought with. Troopers were pushed to carry more ammo on lower rations to move fast and hit hard. They found the American Indians' camp, and Custer decided to hit without scouting or resting his men, even though the Sioux were well rested and fairly set in camp. Worrying about them running, Custer split his forces into three, his force, the supplies with guards, and Captain Reno with his 150 men to make a pincher movement. Custer attacked, and was surprised by the Crazy Horse and Red Cloud Band's response of standing to fight. There had been no practice, no measurement of distances, no formal battle plan. His attack was targeted by the warriors, who started to surround his troops. Cavalry order meant dismount, every third man holding 3 horses. 1/3 of his troops are out of commission. Horses were then to be shot to provide barricades. That works against bullets, not necessarily arrows that could be arced in. Overpressured rounds in soft copper cartridges means jamming. Panic means not aiming properly. 200 men with single-shot rifles against 1,500 plus with repeaters and bows means it's all lopsided. Result? 200 men killed in under 20 minutes with very little casualties inflicted. Reno gets harassed the rest of the night at the riverbed. Benteen rescued Reno the next day. Long story short, this was not Custer's heroic last stand, it was the last stand of the Sioux and Lakota. Red Cloud fled to Canada, Crazy Horse was bayonet in the kidneys, and the fight moved to the American Southwest against the Apache and Comanche. Major General Sir William George Keith Elphinstone and the 1842 Kabul Retreat, aka the Massacre of Elphinstone's Army in the Khyber Pass, January 1842. Elphinstone was commander of the British forces garrisoned in Kabul when forces under Akbar Khan initiated a violent, bloody rebellion resulting in mobs fighting street to street, killing anyone remotely associated with the British, including the ambassador who hid for 2 days then tried to escape to the camp dressed as a woman. The surviving forces pulled back to an outer camp that was immediately besieged with Afghani long-range Jazile muskets pot-shotting them from nearby overlooks. Akbar Khan promised Elphinstone safe passage to Jalalabad through the Khyber Pass, a harrowing hard 90-mile, 140 kilometers, journey, along with supplies and an armed escort on condition of complete disarming of the British forces. It's worthwhile noting that Akbar Khan was a new leader of a tribe among many other warring tribes in the region, and had only temporarily gathered their allegiances. Of course, Major General Elphinstone happily agreed and ordered the disarmament of every one of his 4,500 troops, including Indian sepoys and 12,000 camp followers, which including families, women and children, and tradesmen or women. On January 6, they were sent on their merry way. The logistics immediately turned to chaos as the armed escort and promised supplies were never delivered. The column was not properly structured and became far too dispersed, and the little supplies they had were lost or captured, including blankets and food. And no sooner had they entered the pass did the attacks from the Afghani tribesmen begin. Jazile sniping and raiding war parties harried the column, killing at will without retaliation. Those not shot or stabbed or hacked it directly died of hypothermia. In a show of ultimate capitulation and lack of leadership, Elphinstone and his corps of senior officers rode away from the column and handed themselves over to the Afghani forces as ransom, ensuring their own survival, as aristocracy, which left the column utterly leaderless and reeling in shock. The attacks continued while Elphinstone rested easy as a captive. In the end, a sole survivor, an English surgeon named William Britton, rode up to the Jalalabad garrison on January 13, the only person of the 16,500 people of the column to make it there on his own steam despite a sword wound that scraped off his skull thanks to a deflection from magazine stuffed in his hat, and a stab wound to his knee. Several sepoys were later recovered, and several more British aristocracy were released after ransoms were paid. They set up a GoFundMe in London and elsewhere in the colonies. Overall, less than 200 people are believed to have returned. Elphinstone died of dysentery while in captivity, probably covered in effluent of his own making. Ironically, news of the event hit London in early February like a cannon shot, stunning not only the entire empire but spanning the headlines of every European newspaper and even featured in American newspapers. The Battle, though massacre is more appropriate, of Cajamarca. Francisco Pizarro captured the Incan Emperor Atahualpa with 168 men, outnumbered by the core of the Incan professional army of 8,000 men, and slaughtered thousands without a loss. Atahualpa was on his way to Cuzco with his army of 80,000 after defeating his rival in a civil war and agreed to meet the Spanish in a diplomatic show of good faith. Atahualpa was confident as well that in the middle of his empire, having just crushed his main enemy, that such a small force posed no threat to his warriors. The Spanish laid an ambush and attacked the emperor and his retinue, who were mostly dressed ceremoniously, having left the bulk of his fighting force outside Cajamarca, after a period of unsuccessful negotiations. The Inca had never encountered firearms, horse cavalry, and metal armor. The Spanish arquebus, cannons, and cavalry charges paralyzed the Inca with shock. Before they knew it, the Spanish had slaughtered Atahualpa's litter-bearers and captured the emperor. His army in disarray at the effect of the Spanish guns and their god king being captured turned the attack into a rout, with the Spanish riding down thousands of Inca soldiers as they tried to flee. The main force of 80,000 waiting outside Cajamarca never attempted to intervene, even though it certainly would have ended with them overrunning the Spanish as their ammo dwindled. This marked the beginning of the fall of the Incan Empire. Francisco Pizarro, like his second cousin Hernán Cortés, was a brutal conqueror and dismantled the indigenous Incan culture in just 10 years of rule filled with murder and countless injustices inflicted upon the Incan people. British General Clinton in 1783 during the American Revolution never sent reinforcements from New York to Yorktown, despite repeated and urgent messages saying we will 100% lose if you don't. Literally changed the entire world from that point on. Battle of Leyte Gulf. Halsey committing the whole fleet to chasing empty carriers while the largest battleships in the world along with a heavy complement of battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers strolls into your landing zone, even though you knew it had every intention of doing so but failed to double-check the assumption that it had retreated, certainly ranks up there. Fortunately for Halsey, the US's massive superiority and Kurita's fear made it a footnote rather than a turning point. The Japanese played Halsey like a drum, and only the courage of the tin can soldiers and airmen saved him. He was rewarded with the greatest naval underdog victory in modern times, in absentia. Japan should have wiped out the landing zone along with every ship it encountered. Not something one should count on. Nimitz made his anger clear. Turkey trots TO water GG from Sinkpak Action Com 3rd Fleet Info Comanche CTF 77X. Where is RPT? Where is Task Force 34? RR the World Wonders. Where is Task Force 34? The World Wonders. The World Wonders was not padding. Nimitz was pissed. It was an world record blunder. Halsey knew exactly what he meant when he read it. It was a massive blunder, and he damn well knew it in that moment. The Battle of Cannae. we still study how much of a miserable failure it was. Here's a quick history lesson. In 217 BCE, Rome was being destroyed in the Second Punic War. The Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca had just destroyed Roman armies at the Battle of Trebia, 218 BCE, and later at the Battle of Lake Trasimene, 217 BCE. Both battles were decisive losses for Rome, and the Romans needed a plan to survive. So, the year is 217, and Rome elects Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, known to history as Fabius, as dictator to try and save the Republic. Fabius' tactics were brilliant. He refused to give Hannibal the decisive final victory he needed to destroy Rome for good. Fabius led a war of attrition against Hannibal, which worked like a charm. Hannibal is trapped and can never catch Fabius. Fabian's strategy, as the plan would be no, saves Rome. But there's an issue. The idea of running around tricking Hannibal isn't Roman enough, and the elites want a battle and someone more interested in fighting Hannibal. Even Hannibal knows this and chooses to wait to see what happens. The Senate begins to grumble about this, and after Fabius' term as dictator is over, the Senate refuses to continue his term. In 216, Rome returns to the consul system and elects two men who are more likely to fight Hannibal. Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus are elected, and Rome makes a new army to go after Hannibal. The Roman historian Livy estimates that the Romans had about 40,000 men and 2,400 horses. Hannibal receives word of this and captures the supply depot of Cannae. This leads Rome to send the new army to meet him. Now, a funny thing about Roman armies was that when the two consuls were present, they would take turns leading the army. Varro was famous for his desire to fight Hannibal, and Hannibal knew this. So, he waited when Varro was in charge and lured the Romans into battle. It was a massacre. Hannibal maneuvered his troops so perfectly that he encircled the Roman army and killed them almost to the last man. Accounts say the Romans were packed so tightly that they couldn't raise their weapons to fight. Accounts agree that Varro fled the battle with his bodyguard and that his other consul died with his men at the battle. Rome is desperate now, and they begin to make sacrifices to any god that would listen. One of them must have worked because Hannibal refused to march on Rome and instead sent terms to the Roman Senate. The reason is generally accepted that Hannibal wanted to scare Rome into surrendering. He was mistaken. Rome used this time to make new armies, and they remembered how Fabius had dealt with Hannibal. The idea was to keep cutting Hannibal down with small attacks and supply line raids. Big armies were something that Hannibal understood, but small-scale mobile Roman armies were not. So, the plan was to keep hitting Hannibal's supply lines and force him to be on the defensive. And the Roman plan worked. Hannibal was forced to retreat to Carthage after years of war. Hannibal would finally be defeated at the Battle of Zama in 202. This would lead to Rome winning the Second Punic War. The battle was a huge turning point in Roman history. The Romans never forgot the loss at Cannae and reshaped military doctrine to ensure it would never happen again. The idea of a single general became important, which would lead to Rome destroying Carthage under Scipio Africanus. In a nutshell, Cannae has always fascinated generals and is still taught at war colleges around the world. Here's one that deserves to be better known: the Battle of Patay in 1429. It was the 100 Years' War, French versus English, Joan of Arc and all that. This battle happened a few days after the French had lifted the siege of Orleans. The French had then gone along the Loire River recapturing a few English-controlled forts in minor battles, Jargeau and Beaugency, and were hoping to find the main English army. Meanwhile, the English were getting set to meet the French using Agincourt-style tactics. A key part of that setup was underway, driving stakes into the ground to prevent knights from charging the longbow corps and to slow down infantry troops. Longbowmen were highly trained and specialized troops who were lightly armored and weak in close combat, so the key to making this setup work was to protect them against close combat. Can you guess where this was going? Lack of discipline and poor situational awareness was their undoing. A stag wandered onto the field while the defensive stakes were only partially in place. The archers let up a shout at the sight of the stag and shot at it. This commotion caught the attention of French scouts who had been looking to find the English. What followed has been described as Agincourt in reverse. The French charged in with 180 knights and 1,300 infantry against an English force of 5,000, and the French suffered a mere 3 dead and 100 wounded. Over 2,000 English soldiers died. Estimates vary of total English losses from 2,500 to 4,000 killed and captured. The English longbow corps essentially ceased to exist. Most of the English survivors were knights who fled, among them Sir John Fastolf, the real-life forerunner of Shakespeare's Falstaff, who lost his knighthood in disgrace as a result. All the English commanders on site other than Fastolf were captured. Strategically, this was a far-reaching defeat. It left the English unable to defend their holdings in northern France, which opened a route for a major political reversal, the official crowning of French King Charles VII at Reims. From that point forward, the English were never able to regain momentum in the 100 Years' War. They weren't able to fully repopulate their longbow corps because it takes years to train skilled longbowmen. Meanwhile, the French tax base increased from their 1429 gains, and the French claimant gained legitimacy in the disputed crown of France that both countries had been trying to claim. A little-known one called Task Force Baum. Only reason I know of it is because my grandfather was killed during it. It was volunteer mission and my grandfather liked action. It got him killed. Task Force Baum, also known as the Hammelburg Raid, was a secret and controversial World War II task force set up by U.S. Army General George S. Patton and commanded by Captain Abraham Baum in late March 1945. Baum was given the task of penetrating 50 miles, 80 kilometers, behind German lines and liberating the POWs in Camp Offlog 13B, near Hammelburg. Controversy surrounds the true reasons behind the mission, which most likely was to liberate Patton's son-in-law, John K. Waters, taken captive in Tunisia in 1943. The result of the mission was a complete failure. Of the roughly 300 men of the task force, 32 were killed in action during the raid and only 35 made it back to Allied-controlled territory, with the remainder being taken prisoner. All of the 57 tanks, jeeps, and other vehicles were lost. The Spanish Armada. It caused the deforestation of Spain and arid conditions. The defeat of the Armada started the decline of the Spain and Habsburg dynasty and the rise of the British colonization. The Spanish Armada was a massive 1588 naval fleet sent by King Philip II of Spain to invade England, depose Queen Elizabeth I, and restore Catholicism. The invasion failed due to a combination of English naval tactics, including fireships and superior gunnery, and severe storms that battered the Spanish fleet as it attempted to return to Spain. The defeat of the Armada was a significant event, saving England from invasion and marking a turning point in the decline of the Spanish Empire and the rise of English naval power. Not the worst ever, but I'd like to float the Battle of Okehazama as pretty bad. Yoshimoto Imagawa, one of the most powerful daimyos of his era, is marching with an army of 25,000 men to head to the capital and declare himself shogun. He has to pass through some backwater territory called Owari. Owari has 3,000 soldiers and the leader of the defense is some guy in his 20s who they call the Fool of Owari. And he lost. The Imagawa forces were so overconfident that while they were camped in the middle of enemy territory, they all took off their armor and got drunk. When the Owari forces launched a surprise attack on the camp, Yoshimoto yelled at them to be quiet because he thought it was his own men brawling. He was killed in the attack, and the Imagawa clan was forced out of the region and destroyed soon after. In the golden age of piracy, a young Henry Morgan gathered hundreds of pirates to sack the ultimate prize, Panama. It was a massive campaign that took months to organize, and even more months to actually travel to Panama. This massive band of pirates traveled across the land and swamps of the country we now call Panama, a large amount of them dying along the way because of starvation and disease. Since it was such a massive force of pirates traveling so slowly, word spread quickly of the campaign and Panama City had more than enough time to prepare. The army at Panama City had the brilliant idea of herding hundreds of cattle onto the battlefield outside the city. Their plan was to rile the cattle into a stampede directed at the pirates, trampling a large amount of them. Henry Morgan and his crew were riding on horseback into battle and saw the cattle coming. They started firing their weapons into the air, and the noises startled the cattle so badly that they turned and ran away straight back into the army at Panama City. So in summary, the army defending Panama City was trampled by their own cattle that they brought to the battlefield to try and trample the pirates. The battle was easily and quickly won by Morgan and his pirates. None of it even really mattered, as all of Panama City had been evacuated and all of their treasure, gold, and valuable items had been loaded onto a ship and sailed away long before Henry Morgan's crew arrived. Because there were so many pirates to split basically no prize money with, most of them came away with almost nothing to show for it. The only thing it accomplished was humiliating the Spaniards and making Henry Morgan a living legend back in the homeland of England.